Okay, so you will have a PDF of these instructions for the paper in this class, but I wanted to make a video because the instructions are rather lengthy, and I think it'll be clearer if I walk you through them. So let's start with some of the basics. The length. You want it to be about 5 pages, but I'm really going to be looking at the word count, and that should be as close to 1,500 words as you can get, so plus or minus, 50 or so words is what you should shoot for. And this is maybe shorter than some of the papers you've had to write for other classes, like English classes or history classes. But in philosophy classes, we really emphasize quality over quantity. Now, what is the paper going to be about? So there are lots of different topics that you can choose from. I'm actually going to let you choose your own topic with some restrictions. What you want to do is pick a topic of controversy, some issue where there are two sides that both have a case to be made for them. So I'll go through some topics in a second. But what you want to do is you want your paper is going, or your essay is going to be an argumentative essay. So you're not just going to describe something, you're going to argue for it. And we've talked a lot about arguments, so we should be experts in what those are. Now, a lot of you have probably written an argumentative paper before, but what's going to make this one different is you have to argue for one side and then the other. And then you'll say which of the two arguments you think is stronger. So for instance, let's say you decided to write about the legalization of marijuana in California. So first you would have to argue why you think marijuana ought to be legalized. You could say, for instance, that, it would reduce California's budget by increasing tax revenue, and you would have to back this up with some research and citations. And then you'd argue against the legalization. So maybe you'd say, maybe it turns out that if we legalize it, then there would be a predicted increase in fatal car accidents. And again, you would have to back that up with credible sources. Then you wrap up the paper by explaining which side makes the stronger case. So here are some ideas. You don't have to write about these, but these are options available to you. So here are the restrictions on the topics. In these paper instructions, I give an example of writing about the legalization of marijuana, and because I give I give a whole introductory paragraph, I'm going to restrict you from writing about that topic and some other ones that are just too cliche. So, to be clear, your paper cannot be about the legalization of marijuana, and it can't be about any of these other topics that have these little stars next to them. So you can't write about abortion or capital punishment, euthanasia, gay marriage, or stem cell research. I've just read too many papers on these topics, and a lot of them are a bit too broad anyway. I think that the best way to start this paper is to start with by reading the news and finding an article that brings up some debate. Okay, for example, there was a recent article about tanning beds in gyms like 24-Hour Fitness or Gold's Gym. And they passed legislation in California, I believe, that made it, there was a ban on tanning beds in these gyms for individuals who were under the age of 18, for minors. So your paper could be whether or not that ban is a good idea or not, right? So the case for it is, well, these people are minors, they haven't fully developed their ability to make responsible decisions, and tanning beds can be very damaging to your skin and can lead to skin cancer. And that's fine if you're an adult, you can make that decision, But if you're a minor, then it shouldn't be allowed. And then the case against the ban would be that this is the government being too paternalistic and being too involved in our personal freedom. So it's a freedom issue. All right, it's like, minors still have rights and still have freedoms, and this would be infringing upon those. So that would be an example. There's another recent article about plastic bags. So in San Francisco and in other places like Santa Cruz, there's a ban on plastic bags in the city limits. So if you go to a grocery store, they won't carry plastic bags anymore. And that would be a great issue. The reason why that would be good and why the tanning bed ban would be good is because they're really specific. I think a problem with a lot of these issues, if you pick something like capital punishment, it's just so broad. You could write a book about whether or not it should be legalized or not, or should be banned or not. But with these really specific issues, it's perfect for 5 pages, right? So plastic bags, you could, in a couple pages make the case for, in a couple pages make the case against, and then wrap it up. So it would just be perfect. So here are some other topics. A lot of these are probably too broad. I would find something a little bit more specific. These are in no particular order, but you could write about FDA regulations. That's the Food and Drug Administration, government agency, and there. If you go to the grocery store, on almost all the items there are the nutrition facts. Well, that's required by the government, and that's been there for so long, we're used to those being there, but there was a point when that wasn't required. And you could argue that companies should have the freedom to, they don't have to, maybe they should have to put the ingredients, but why the nutrition? Because if I'm an ice cream manufacturer, I don't want to put the nutrition facts necessarily because that might detract from my patronage of my products. Customers aren't going to want to buy my product if they see how unhealthy it is. Another great issue would be if you notice at restaurants that are chains, they now have the amount of calories in each menu item. So is that a good idea or not? So the argument for would be something like it's just information. It just makes makes for an informed consumer. Our country has issues with obesity. And in America, we have these supersized portions, like literally they're called supersize, at McDonald's. And we're trying to be healthier, and this will just help. And then the argument against would be that it's too much of a burden on companies. Companies should have more freedom. Let the market, let them, So if the market demands this, if people want it, then the companies will do it on their own. And that it's kind of government sticking its nose where it doesn't belong. So that would be another great example of a topic. But any of these would be okay. This LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer issues. So, there's lots of issues that concern members of that community. Gun control is really an issue that has been all over the news, obviously in the wake of what happened in at Newtown at the school, the elementary school. So that could be something that would be of interest. Here are some other ones. I won't read all these, there are too many, but abolition of the Electoral College, body scanning, right? So if you go to the airport, they have these machines that kind of scan you, and they kind of reveal a lot of, maybe they can kind of see what you look like nude, but the people say, oh, it's someone in another room, they're never going to actually see you, but other people feel kind of violated. Prostitution, vaccinations, should they be required, or is that, or do they do more damage than not? Vitamin supplements, are those just kind of ploys? Do they actually work, or are they just We need vitamins, but just because you take a pill doesn't mean your body absorbs them, right? Maybe you take a bunch of vitamins, but your body passes them all, and it's a waste. Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of issues. And if you if you want to write about something that's not on this list, then send me an email and ask me. So if I get a paper and you didn't run it by me and it's not on this list, then I might not give you credit. So make sure to email me and run it by me if you want to do something not on this list. Okay, so those are the topics. Now let's go through some of the other issues, like audience. So who should you have in mind when you're writing this paper? Who are you sort of writing it for? You might think, well, aren't I writing for you, Ryan? And the answer is yes and no. Of course, I'm the one reading it, but I want the audience, I want you to imagine that it's really a peer, a fellow Gavlin student. I would love for you to write the paper such that if you handed it to some random person hanging out at the bookstore or something, they'd read it and they'd say something like, I didn't really think too much about the legalization of marijuana, but your paper clearly lays out the pros and cons. Like maybe they would say, before I was totally for it, like a lot of young people are like, yeah, let's legalize pot. But maybe they didn't really think about the counter arguments. So it would be really informative. So you want to write it in a way that would be clear and concise to them, right? So they could read it and they wouldn't get confused, and it wouldn't be over their head. Okay. Tone. Unfortunately, the tone of academic papers arguably has started to change, especially in light of our obsession with text messaging and abbreviations. So make sure that it's academic. Make sure that it's not too colloquial. So that word colloquial means informal. You don't want it to sound like an email to a friend or a text message. You want it to be a college academic paper. You also want your tone to be objective and neutral. So it should not, this is really important. It should not be clear to me which side of the argument you are on until you get through both of the pros and cons of each side, and then in the end you tell me. So we talked a lot about rhetoric and bias. You don't want to have any of that spill onto the page. You want it to read almost like a newspaper article, like from the New York Times or from USA Today or something. And, you just want to kind of take that journalistic objective stance, and you're kind of providing the case for and the case against. And make sure it's the best case for and the best case against. We talked about straw man argument. You don't want, let's say that you're really in favor of legalization of marijuana and you lay out these wonderful points and it's very compelling. And then when you get to the argument against, you just kind of distort the best points and you even omit some of them and you just say, yeah, the people against it, they just have sticks up their asses and, they just think that marijuana is for hippie, lazy people or something. So that does not capture the best points against it. So that's your tone. In terms of the style, I'd like it to be an MLA, which is good because a lot of you will be familiar with it. If you're not, then there are some guidelines in this video and on the instructions, the PDF of the instructions. And I'm going to include on iLearn 2 sample papers in MLA format and also a PDF just giving the quick and dirty guidelines on MLA. So here are some of the basics. It's got to be typed, double spaced. The margins around should be 1 inch. So usually the standard on a lot of word processors is 1.25 inches. So you actually have to change them to 1 inch. And the font should be Times New Roman or something comparable to that in size and readability, size 12. You're not going to include a cover sheet, no title page, and I know this is online, so obviously you're not going to have a report cover or something. You're just going to, so obviously you're not going to staple it either. Okay, so these are obviously instructions I've also used for my non-online classes. And so it says MLA guidelines on Blackboard, but that should say iLearn. And you're going to submit it on iLearn. And if you have any trouble with that, then you can always just email it to me as a backup. But you'll just go to, there'll be an assignment in iLearn, and there'll be a place for you to upload it. So I want you to do two things. I want you to upload the paper as an attachment, and I also want you to cut and paste the text into a box, just like you would in an email. Okay, so here's more on MLA. The first page is going to look like this. So it's going to have your name, the class number, the instructor's name, and the date. And that's in the upper left-hand corner. All of this is double-spaced. Then the title should follow. There shouldn't be any extra spaces. Nothing should be italicized or enlarged or big font or underlined. And the title is just in the middle. And the entire paper, from the name, title, all the block quotes, the works cited, all of it's double-spaced. And on every page in the top right-hand corner portion of the header should be your last name, a space, and then the page number. So there's not really actually an example here, but in the sample MLA ones that will be online, you will have an example of that. Okay, so it looks something like this. This first paragraph is a good example of what I call the introductory paragraph, and I would love for your first paragraph to be similar in format. So first, you want to avoid having a first line that's really vague and cliche and just reminiscent of sort of that funnel intro from high school papers. You know, something like, since the dawn of mankind, human beings have, pondered philosophical issues, and then you kind of funnel it down to a thesis statement. What I would love in your first paragraph is just jump right into it. You don't have to kind of beat around the bush. Just set up your agenda. It's almost like a little outline in a paragraph form of what's going to come. Feel free to use pronouns like I and we. So in some classes or in high school you're taught not to do that, but that's because when you write as a child, you're always writing with I, and you have to learn to train yourself to write more objectively and use third-person pronouns like he, she, and they. But now that you have mastered that, you can go back to the I, and it can really work well even in a college paper, as you can see from this paragraph. So in this essay, I will address whether or not the state of California ought to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. So look at that. Right off the bat, I jump into it and I tell you, this is a paper about this issue, legalization of marijuana. I will first make the case that marijuana for recreational use ought to be legalized. The primary support for legalization will center on the increased tax revenues that would go to fix the state's budget crisis. So I tell you, I'm going to make the case for, and then here's the biggest piece of evidence, and then I will argue against cannabis legalization. And here's the biggest premise for that. The largest drawback to legalization would likely be increase in fatal automobile accidents. After carefully considering the pros and cons of each position, I will argue which side is stronger. Okay, so isn't that just clear? It tells you exactly what you're going to see. So if I get lost in your paper at any point, I can go back to that agenda paragraph and catch myself up. Okay, citations. Do you have to do them? The answer is yes. I mean, in the marijuana example paper, you think about you have to do some research to find out, will there be an increase in tax revenue? Would there be an increase in fatal auto accidents, right? You don't know that off the top of your head, so you're going to have to do some research, and they need to be credible sources. We spent a whole section on credibility, so now you know what sources are going to cut it and what won't. So be very careful with online, right? I would start with academic books that you find in the library or academic stuff that you can link to from the library, especially if it's peer-edited academic journals. Those are some of the most credible sources around. So how many sources do you need? You need 3 sources. Okay? So there's not a minimum or maximum number of quotations or paraphrasing, but you need to have at least 3 sources. Citations, so quotations and paraphrasing, They're helpful to emphasize a difficult or technical point or to provide evidence for a claim. For instance, like I said, in the sample paper, you need to cite research that demonstrates how legalizing marijuana would increase tax revenue or how it would affect fatal auto accidents. But, a common mistake is to oversight. A lot of times, if I added up all the quotations in the paper, if I strung them all together, it would add up to, 20% or more of the paper. So, we instructors, we know that trick. It's like, it's a race to 1,500 words, and the more I cite, the less I have to write. It's like that rhymes. So obviously, we know about this, and you're going to lose points. And the citations, they have to be in accord with MLA formatting, so they should be in text. For example, let's say you have this quote: the legalization of marijuana for recreational use would translate into approximately $30 million a year in increased tax revenue. So that's in quotation marks, and there's a space, and then in parentheses you have the author's last name, a space, and then the page number. And if you use citations, which you need 3 sources, you're going to have a works cited page. And so this is what it looks like. It's not references or bibliography. It's called works cited. Works is plural. It's not underlined. And then you have the entries here. So this should actually be double spaced, but it's not because when I cut and pasted it into the PowerPoint. But you've got author's last name, comma, first name, period, then the title of the entry. So if it's a book, it's italicized or underlined. If it's an article, you put it in quotation marks. Then you have the place where it was published, colon, name of the publisher, comma, the year it was published. And now what's new for MLA is because there are so many online resources, if it's a book, you're going to put print. And if it's from the internet, you're going to put web and the date that you accessed it. Also, you don't have to put the giant URL if you're going to have an online source, because those are getting so long. You're going to cut that out. And look at the MLA guidelines on how to cite things from online. But essentially, you're just going to put the name of the website and not the whole URL. Okay, so I talked about the introductory paragraph. Definitely avoid the since the dawn of time, humans have pursued wisdom, or throughout history, people have always pondered philosophical issues, those sorts of lines. Just get into it. Here are some writing tips. Precision and concision, or conciseness. Being precise means that you're accurate. Being concise means that you're being economical with your words. Being precise also means that you choose your words carefully. It means writing clearly and unambiguously and saying what you really mean. Not being vague is key to being precise. For example, if I wasn't precise, I would just say something like, marijuana is bad for the state. But it leaves the reader asking too many questions. Like, what exactly do you mean? Like, bad in what way? Bad in terms of health, or, fiscally in terms of money? Concision or conciseness is about being economical and using as few words as possible to make your sentences flow. You only have 5 pages, so you should write economically. You can't afford to money up your paper with convoluted, wordy, or redundant sentences. So here's a sentence that lacks concision. It's quite possible many students' intuitions about marijuana are the same as what most people would say when asked the question, what would you do? Live a life with drugs or without? Think about your life without superfluous trance experiences. The answer is simple, no way. That sentence is super wordy, it's very confusing. You have to read it several times just to figure out what the heck it's saying. But here's another, it's a run-on, here's an example of a sentence that conveys the same essential meaning, but it's much easier to read. Most people consume some sort of drugs, legal or illegal. Most people probably couldn't imagine life without the occasional use of drugs. That's what the person above is saying. It's much more clear when you articulate it that way. It's much better written, and you don't have to read it several times to figure out what's being said. Avoids phrases like the vast unoccupied abyss, right? That's redundant. If something's an abyss, then it's by definition unoccupied. Another classic example of a redundant statement I see a lot in college papers is the phrase, that's a true fact, right? You don't need to say true. If something's a fact, then it's by definition true. I mean, what's an example of a fact that's not true? So you don't need to say true. Was there a false fact? No, if something's false, then it can't be a fact. We talked a lot about rhetoric, and that's something you want to avoid. So you want to keep your emotional tone out of the paper. You want it to be neutral and dispassionate. So let's say you despise marijuana. You wouldn't want your distaste for it to spill out onto the page. You know, if you said you don't want a sentence like, "But if pot enthusiasts had their way, we would all be toking all day long. Only an idiot would believe in legalization." So there are two rhetorical devices here. There's exaggeration or hyperbole and ad hominem, and you want to avoid that. So here's a way to express what's going on in that sentence without the rhetoric. Many worry that legalization would lead to overconsumption of marijuana. Right? You see how that's much more objective? That's the tone you want for your paper. I really encourage you to revise and edit carefully and do your paper over time. Don't put it off until the last minute. I know the precedent in college is to wait until the last minute, but this is a huge obstacle of good writing. Even the best writers, they're not going to get it right at the first time. You know, imagine a filmmaker that tried to make a film on one take. It would be awful, right? So I implore you to write at least one draft of your paper before the final draft. A good exercise after you've written one draft is to imagine that you've lost your computer and you have to start from scratch. Imagine writing the whole paper over again. If you at least start an outline from scratch, then usually that outline is much better organized than the first attempt. And getting feedback is really important. So feel free to email me a draft before the due date. Anytime is okay. But just realize that if it's a couple days before it's due, there's a chance I might not be able to get it. I also encourage you to read your paper out loud, slowly, to proofread it. It can be also helpful to print out a copy to read aloud, or read a copy out loud while someone else reads along. These methods are good at catching typos and weeding out sentences that are confusing or hard to understand. Alright, so let's talk about grading. You know, it's one of the most difficult things I have to do as an instructor because it can be subjective to a certain point. And I hesitate to offer a rubric, but just keep in mind that what you say is the most important. I'm really looking at the content of your arguments. Are they compelling? Are they sound? Are they cogent? Have you avoided deploying a straw man version of one side? Are your premises true or credible? Are your inferences strong or valid? So that's the most important thing. The content, the overall structure, and have you picked an issue that has two sides and have you addressed those two sides carefully and meticulously? And then after that, I care about the writing. So how you say these things is important, but not as important as the content. Is your paper well written? Did you follow the tips and strategies in these instructions? Did you lay out the agenda early on? Did you avoid vagueness, ambiguity, and wordiness? How does it flow? Is it too confusing? Is the language too emotive or rhetorical? And then the last thing I look at, the least important, are the details, like grammar, spelling, formatting errors. Is it an MLA format? Obviously, a late paper will be detrimental to your grade, so avoid that. You know, I might not accept it, or I might accept it and take off half a letter grade or a whole letter grade. You know, it just depends on the circumstances. But I just would avoid it altogether. And of course, don't plagiarize. I've caught people for plagiarizing. I've sent their paper to the dean. People have gotten Fs in courses. People have gotten marks on their permanent record. People have gotten close to being expelled. It's really obvious. It's a desperate move. I would just say, if you're going to plagiarize, don't even turn in a paper. It's not even worth the risk at all. It's better to get a 0 and get a bad, maybe get just a C in the course or something, than it is to just risk it. So just don't do it. A lot of times you think your people are being sneaky. I actually caught someone recently, and they took a source from the internet, and they kind of reworded the things, but it was just super obvious that they lifted it from an internet website. Okay, so I'll talk about the due dates in an email or on iLearn. All right, good luck.